And may the Schwartz be with you.
Picture this. It's the summer of 1987. Top Gun has already made aviator sunglasses a personality. Dirty Dancing is about to make Patrick Swayze a god. And somewhere in a Hollywood lot still haunted by the ghost of Judy Garland, a short Jewish comedian is suiting up in gold face paint, kneeling on a soundstage, and about to deliver the line, "May the Schwartz be with you." That man is Mel Brooks. The movie is Spaceballs. And for the next 96 minutes, he is going to drag the most sacred franchise in cinematic history through a comedy car wash, and somehow come out the other side with a movie that people are still quoting 4 decades later. Spaceballs is a film that should not work. It arrived 4 years after Return of the Jedi had wrapped up the original Star Wars trilogy. Critics thought the window for Star Wars parody had already slammed shut. The box office was, to put it kindly, respectable rather than triumphant. And yet here we are, in an era where a Spaceballs sequel is actually in production at Amazon MGM Studios, with the original cast returning and a whole new generation of fans who discovered the film on cable, VHS, and eventually streaming. So how did a movie that got a B- from audiences on its opening weekend become an immortal piece of pop culture? And what was going on behind the cameras that most people have never heard? Today, we're counting down 15 weird facts you never knew about Spaceballs, from a legendary special effects company you'd never expect helping build this comedy, to a novelization written by someone who would later terrify an entirely different generation of kids, to a stray piece of yellow brick that showed up in completely the wrong movie. Let's get into it. Everyone knows that Mel Brooks called George Lucas before making Spaceballs and got his blessing. That story has been told many times. What's less widely known is exactly how enthusiastic Lucas was about the whole thing. Brooks later described his strategy as a piece of brilliance disguised as politeness. Before production started, he sent Lucas the screenplay, and Lucas didn't just read it. He loved it. But Brooks wasn't finished being clever. He then offered Lucas's post-production company, Industrial Light and Magic, the contract for the film's effects work. As Brooks himself explained, he knew that booking ILM for nearly $5 million worth of post-production work was the smartest insurance policy he could buy. His exact logic: you can't really object to a parody if you're cashing the check for it. ILM, of course, was the special effects house that had revolutionized cinema with Star Wars in 1977. Having them work on a comedy that was lovingly mocking their own flagship product was a genuinely surreal arrangement. And it worked. The escape pod launch sequence in Spaceballs actually uses unused footage provided directly by Lucasfilm from Star Wars, Episode 4. So parts of the film you're watching as a Star Wars parody are, technically, made of Star Wars. After the film came out, Lucas wrote Brooks a personal note, saying he was afraid he was going to bust something from laughing. That's the highest possible endorsement. The man who invented the Force confirmed the Schwartz was real. When you're shooting a movie about space travel and galactic empires, you need big sound stages. The Spaceballs production set up at MGM's lot in Culver City, California, and what they found there was genuinely strange. The studio had, in an earlier era of filmmaking, constructed a massive pool for productions built around swimmers like Esther Williams. By the 1980s, that pool was covered with retractable flooring, giving the crew a giant, flat indoor space. Practical enough. But here's where it gets weird. Spaceballs filmed several key scenes on the very same soundstage used for The Wizard of Oz in 1939. And decades later, the evidence was still there. Cast and crew members reported occasionally finding stray pieces of the yellow brick road scattered around the stage, leftover bricks from Dorothy's Journey, just lying around waiting to be discovered in the background of a space comedy. Brooks later noted this with his characteristic mixture of pride and absurdity. The temple where yogurt dispenses wisdom about the Schwartz, shot on the same floor where the Wicked Witch melted. There's something poetically Mel Brooks about that. The man who spent his career finding comedy in the spaces between history was literally filming on top of cinema's past. Here's one that genuinely stops people in their tracks. Spaceballs was adapted into a novelization to coincide with its release in 1987. Film novelizations were common practice at the time, a way to squeeze a little extra money out of a property. Normally, not particularly interesting, Except this one was written by a then relatively obscure writer working under the pen name Jovial Bob Stein. That's right, R.L. Stein, the man who would go on to write the Goosebumps series and give nightmares to an entire generation of children throughout the 1990s, wrote the Spaceballs novelization. He was credited alongside Brooks and the other screenwriters Thomas Meehan and Ronnie Graham. Stein had been writing humor books for kids and young adults throughout the late 1970s and 1980s before the horror pivot that made him famous. The Spaceballs novelization, adapted for a younger audience, had to soften some of the film's earthier jokes, which, given some of the gags in the actual movie, must have required genuine creativity. So the next time a kid picks up a Goosebumps book, know that the author once sat down and transcribed Dark Helmet's action figure monologue into prose. That is a sentence that should not be true, but absolutely is. Dark Helmet is one of the great comedy villain performances in movie history. Rick Moranis, draped in meters of black plastic and powered by pure neurotic energy, created a character that is somehow both a perfect Darth Vader parody and an entirely original comic creation. You believe in Dark Helmet's wounded pride, his petty grievances, his need to be taken seriously by people who clearly never will. What most people don't know is how much physical misery went into that performance. The helmet itself was enormous, a deliberately oversized prop designed to make Moranis look ridiculous, while simultaneously making it almost impossible for him to function. The visor regularly obscured his vision, meaning Moranis was frequently navigating the sleek, glossy sets of Spaceball 1 essentially blind. The helmet was heavy. It was unbalanced. It was, by multiple accounts, a genuine ordeal to wear for extended periods. Moranis later described the experience as inconsistent and messy, while simultaneously acknowledging that it was fun. That kind of contradiction, painful in practice, joyful in spirit, is very specific to certain kinds of comedy performance. The suffering produces the laugh. And in at least one famous case, the prop fought back. There's a deliberate running gag in Brooks's films where something goes wrong on camera. A boomite gets hit by a lightsaber. A camera zooms in too close. In Spaceballs, that camera zooms so far in on Dark Helmet that it physically collides with the helmet itself. Moranis takes the hit. Brooks kept the take. That's the job. The moment where Dark Helmet sits alone in his command center, playing with action figures and narrating a romance between the Lone Star and Princess Vespa dolls, is one of the most beloved scenes in the film. It's startlingly intimate for a space opera parody. It tells you everything about this character, his loneliness, his grandiosity, his capacity to turn even villainy into a private fantasy. It was not in the screenplay. According to both Brooks and Moranis, the scene was born entirely on the day of filming. Brooks had an idea, pulled Moranis aside, described the general concept, and then essentially said go. Moranis improvised the entire scene, including all the dialogue. The dolls, the voices, the precise arc of the miniature drama, all of it came from Moranis in real time. Brooks recognized immediately what he had. He didn't cut it. He built the surrounding scene around it. The result is something that plays like it was scripted with surgical precision, which makes it even more impressive. Moranis wasn't playing a character. He was excavating one, live, in a helmet he could barely see out of. Before Bill Pullman suited up as the reluctant hero Lone Star, Mel Brooks went looking for a leading man and hit a wall. Twice. According to Bill Pullman himself, Brooks approached Tom Cruise for the role. Cruise passed. He then went to Tom Hanks, who also declined. Both men were on upward trajectories at the time. Cruise had just made Top Gun in 1986, and Hanks was coming off Nothing in Common. Neither apparently wanted to sign on for a comedy that required them to deliver lines about having barf as a travel companion. Their loss became Pullman's gain. Pullman was, at the time, a stage actor who had not yet had a major starring role in film. He was, by some accounts, still doing carpentry work between auditions. Brooks saw something in his particular mix of leading man looks and genuine bewilderment, the quality of a man who has stumbled into heroism and isn't entirely sure how he got there. Pullman's later reflections on the experience were honest. He was nervous stepping onto a set full of established comedy legends, but he absorbed something from the experience that he credited with sharpening his instincts going forward. Comedy, it turns out, is a very useful education even for actors who go on to spend most of their careers in dramas and thrillers. Ask anyone who later had to give an inspirational speech about independence and alien invasions whether comedic timing helps. Joan Rivers provided the voice of Matrix, the sarcastic, golden-plated droid who serves as Princess Vespa's companion, from the comfort of a recording studio. What she did not provide was her body. The physical performance of Matrix was handled by Laureen Yarnell, a mime and dancer who was one half of the celebrated mime duo Shields and Yarnell. The Shields and Yarnell act had been a significant novelty television attraction in the late 1970s, known for their robotic movement style, which made Yarnell an obvious choice to inhabit a character who was supposed to move like a machine. The costume she wore was rigid fiberglass, not padded, not flexible, fiberglass. The suit was so stiff that Yarnell could not sit down or raise her arms above her sides for the entire duration of her scenes. In retrospect, the awkward, stiff gait you see in Matrix's movement wasn't just acting, it was physics. The costume imposed its own movement restrictions, and Yarnell had no choice but to work within them. The unintended result was a performance that looked perfectly robotic, because it quite literally was. The comedy of Matrix's striding, stiff-armed walk came, at least partly, from genuine inability to do anything else. Yarnell later noted that while Brooks insisted he was happy with a character that looked like C-3PO's sassy cousin, wearing a rigid fiberglass bodysuit under studio lights was not exactly a vacation. Rivers and Yarnell never met during production. They were working in different time zones, in different rooms, creating a single character that somehow felt completely unified on screen. Police Academy fans will recognize Michael Winslow immediately. He's the sound effects guy, the human being whose mouth can produce virtually any noise in the audible spectrum. In Spaceballs, he appears briefly as a radar technician aboard Spaceball 1, and the scene is built entirely around his talent. What's funny about this from a production standpoint is that his presence was, in the most literal sense, a cost-saving measure. The sounds Winslow makes in the film, the bleeps, the sweeps, and the creeps, were supposed to be provided by the sound effects department. When Winslow arrived on set, someone had the obvious idea that his human beatbox approach would be cheaper, faster, and funnier than anything the department could produce. They were right on all three counts. Winslow created the radar sounds live, on camera, in one take. The production saved the cost of hiring a sound effects team for that sequence. The scene became more genuinely absurd because a human being is obviously making those sounds, and Moranis' reaction as Dark Helmet. Bafflement shading into irritation, shading into a kind of exhausted acceptance, is funnier because Winslow's performance is so committed. It is possible that no single cameo in film history has been simultaneously more cost-effective and more artistically defensible. When Mel Brooks convinced John Hurt to come in and parody his own chest-burster death from Alien, he assured Hurt it would be a simple cameo, a quick walk-on. Easy work, easy money. Hurt said yes. He showed up on set to find an elaborate, full-scale recreation of the Alien diner scene, the same table, the same mise-en-scene, waiting for him. By that point, it was too late to be surprised. Hurt later joked that he probably should have negotiated harder. The tiny alien puppet that erupts from Hurt's chest in a top hat, grabs a cane, and performs a song and dance number was built by Industrial Light and Magic. That's the same effects house that created the chestburster in Alien in the first place, working under H.R. Geiger's designs. Now, they were rebuilding their own nightmare creation in miniature to perform musical comedy. Hurt filmed the entire sequence in a single day. He reportedly loved it. His own description of the experience, essentially that it was the most fun he'd ever had dying, captures something genuine about how Spaceballs operated. It respected the things it mocked. Hurt didn't show up to trash his legacy. He showed up to celebrate it from a different angle, and ILM built him the perfect tiny prop to do it with. The scene where Dark Helmet and Colonel Sanders rent a VHS copy of Spaceballs from a space video store before the movie is even finished, and fast forward to the exact moment they're currently living through, is one of the most technically interesting gags in the film. It looks spontaneous. It isn't. For the scene to work, the footage playing on the screen inside the movie had to match what was actually happening in real time. That meant the production had to carefully calculate exactly when the instant cassette scene would occur in the final cut of the film, then work backward to ensure that the moment Helmet says, "There we are," while watching the tape, the image on screen shows exactly that moment. It's a loop. Loops require planning. Brooks described the original inspiration as coming from the experience of buying a VCR and watching movies at home. The novelty of being able to pause and rewind something, to have control over the movie's timeline. He thought, what if the characters in the movie had that same power? What if being in a movie didn't protect you from watching it? The gag also functions as a parody of the home video boom of the mid-1980s, when studios discovered that theatrical releases were just the opening act of a much longer commercial life on tape. Brooks was making fun of the business model that would ultimately rescue his own movie from obscurity. There's a recursive irony in there that he was certainly smart enough to intend. Spaceballs is usually described as a Star Wars parody, and it is, obviously. But Brooks and his co-writers Thomas Meehan and Ronnie Graham were operating with a wider scope than most people remember. The film systematically targets Alien, the John Hurt chestburster scene, Planet of the Apes, the Mega Maid's head on the beach, Star Trek, the Eagle 5's resemblance to a RV-shaped Enterprise nacelle, The Wizard of Oz, the Dinks singing the march from Bridge on the River Kwai, and Yogurt's closing, What a World, What a World. 2001, A Space Odyssey, and even Transformers. Optimus Prime appears on the cover of the Spaceballs coloring book during the yogurt merchandising scene. The Wizard of Oz connection runs especially deep, partly because they were filming on the same soundstage. There are echoes everywhere. Lone Star and his companions walking to see Yogurt in the desert recall Dorothy and her friends en route to see the wizard. Yogurt himself disappears in a swirl of smoke. It's not accidental. Brooks was shooting on the same floor where those scenes were originally filmed, and the ghosts of that production seeped into the script. The breadth of reference points means Spaceballs rewards repeat viewing in a specific way. Each time you watch it with a slightly better film education, you catch something new. It's structured like a prank pulled by someone who has watched everything. Mel Brooks's character, President Scroob, the clueless, vain, incompetent leader of Planet Spaceball, has a name that is, in fact, Brooks spelled backward. Skrob. Skob reversed is, well, close enough. Brooks has acknowledged this in interviews, framing it as the kind of self-deprecating gag that runs through his work. He consistently puts himself in his own films as an idiot. In Blazing Saddles, he played the governor, a man so feeble he can be manipulated by anyone. In History of the World, Part 1, he appeared as Louis XVI, the embodiment of royal uselessness. In Spaceballs, he is both the comic philosopher sage and the most incompetent executive in the galaxy. The backward name joke is also a nod to a tradition in parody filmmaking of hiding authorship in plain sight, as if the creator is smuggling themselves into the fiction under a thin disguise. Scroob is Brooks, right there in the spelling, and the joke works on multiple levels. It's self-referential, it's modest, you have to look to find it. And it's also a little bit of a wink that the man making fun of power fantasies has cast himself as the embodiment of powerful failure. The closing credits of Spaceballs feature a full, synth-driven pop song called simply Spaceballs, performed by the Spinners, which means one of the most celebrated R&B vocal groups in American music history recorded a song about a comedy space parody in 1987, and that is not a sentence that requires any additional embellishment. The Spinners had been recording hits since the early 1960s. They were a Motown act before moving to Atlantic Records, where they produced a string of genuine soul classics throughout the 1970s, songs that defined the texture of the era. Then Mel Brooks called, and they recorded Spaceballs. Co-written by Brooks and his longtime composer John Morris, the song is self-aware in the best way. A strutting, keyboard-heavy number that sounds like it wandered in from a different film entirely, which is precisely the point. It's a joke about the fact that Star Wars had John Williams' triumphant orchestral score and Spaceballs has, instead, the Spinners doing their best disco-funk impression over a synthesizer. The song didn't chart. It didn't need to. It became one of those details that fans track down and then describe to other fans with the specific kind of gleeful incredulity. Morris's collaboration with Brooks was a through line across multiple films. his understanding of Brooks's aesthetic, which is essentially, take everything seriously until suddenly you don't, gave him the right instincts for a movie that needed to be both the space epic it was parodying and also the exact opposite of it, simultaneously, in the same frame. Pizza the Hut, the film slug-like, marinara-dripping crime boss, is one of the most elaborate practical effects creatures in Spaceballs. He is also, by some distance, the most physically dangerous element of the entire production. The design was handled by special effects artist Ken Diaz, and the suit was worn from the inside by performer Rick Lazzarini, who operated the creature's movement through the rubber and fiberglass exterior. The cheese effect, the oozing, melting quality that makes Pizza the Hut look genuinely disgusting, was achieved using a heated compound meant to simulate the behavior of melted mozzarella under studio lights. The problem is that the compound had to stay warm to keep flowing convincingly, which meant keeping the entire suit under heat lamps for extended periods, which meant that the compound, in proximity to a human being, did what heated dairy products generally do when they meet skin. It burned. According to production accounts, the actor inside the suit suffered second- and third-degree burns during filming. The experience was, by any reasonable measure, nightmarish. Heat, confined space, no airflow, and a substance designed to mimic cheese actually behaving like cheese. One effects crew member later quit after Brooks requested reshoots. The voice was provided from an air-conditioned recording booth by Dom DeLucy, who experienced none of this, and who delivered Pizza the Hut's threatening lines with the smooth, unhurried menace of someone who is very comfortable. When Pizza the Hut meets his end later in the film, having consumed himself, it plays as a throwaway gag. For the people who made it, it was a survival story. When Yogurt breaks the fourth wall near the end of Spaceballs to hawk merchandise, he closes with a teaser. God willing, we'll all meet again in Spaceballs 2, The Search for More Money. In 1987, this was a joke about Hollywood's sequel obsession. By 1990, it was a running gag. By 2000, it was a piece of comedy mythology, a punchline that had outlasted the era it was mocking. By 2015, it was something fans repeated to each other with fond nostalgia for a sequel that would obviously never happen, given that John Candy, Dom DeLucy, and Joan Rivers had all passed away. And then, somehow, it started becoming real. According to confirmed reports as of 2025 and 2026, a Spaceballs sequel is in active production at Amazon MGM Studios. The film is titled Spaceballs, The New One. It is directed by Josh Greenbaum and co-written by Josh Gad and Mel Brooks himself. The cast includes Rick Moranis, ending his long public retirement from film, alongside Bill Pullman, Daphne Zuniga, and George Weiner reprising their original roles. Brooks is returning as Yogurt, and possibly President Scrub. New cast members include Keke Palmer, Josh Gad, and Lewis Pullman, Bill's son, in new roles. A theatrical release is planned for 2027. The sequel is, in itself, a joke about sequels. It is a parody of the idea of making sequels, made by the people who